Restaurant staff denies veteran service, only to discover he's the owner. Tom Jefferson had long since settled into a quiet rhythm in his life. After retiring from the Marines, he had embarked on a new chapter that, to many, seemed just as structured and purpose-driven as his military career had been. The transition from military service to civilian life had been, in many ways, a smooth one. He'd always been the type of person who thrived on routine, on discipline, on structure. In fact, it was these very traits that had propelled him through both his years in the service and the journey that followed. But now, as the owner of a fine dining restaurant in downtown Chicago, his life was a careful balance between professional achievement and personal satisfaction, between running a successful business and taking pride in the community he had created. Before we can continue, if you support veterans, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. The restaurant, Jefferson's, was not merely a business to Tom. It was a culmination of a dream that had taken shape over the course of decades. It was a place where Tom could finally let down his guard after years of service to his country, where he could blend his love for people with his passion for food and hospitality. To those who came through the doors, Jefferson's was a symbol of class and elegance. The decor was impeccable: rich wood panels, vintage Art Deco light fixtures, plush chairs that enveloped diners in comfort. The service was smooth and courteous, but not overbearing, and the kitchen churned out exquisitely prepared dishes, each one in homage to Tom's own love of culinary art. But despite the upscale environment, Tom had never been one for pretension. He had no need to surround himself with extravagance or to embody the typical image of a fine dining restaurant owner. To him, the restaurant was more about the experience, the ability to bring people together through the art of food, to create a space where anyone, regardless of their background, could find comfort in a warm meal and a pleasant atmosphere. That was why Tom often chose to wear the same simple clothes when he visited the restaurant. His faded green cap, worn t-shirt, and jeans had become as much a part of the establishment as the polished floors and glistening silverware. To Tom, this attire was a symbol of who he was, not an owner of a successful restaurant, but a regular man who appreciated life's simple pleasures. He wasn't one to show up in a suit or a crisp blazer, as was typical for many owners in the fine dining industry. Instead, Tom embodied a quiet humility, always preferring to sit in a corner booth or at the bar, where he could observe the dynamics of his restaurant in a less obvious way. He was content to simply be present, without needing to draw attention to himself. For the most part, the staff knew who he was. There were a few familiar faces who had been with him since the restaurant's opening, but Tom never insisted on any special treatment. He would chat briefly with the chefs, offer a few words of encouragement, and then settle into the rhythm of the day, never disrupting the flow of the establishment. Every day, Tom made it a point to come in for lunch. It was part of his routine, a habit that had helped him maintain a connection with his restaurant and with his staff. He had seen the faces of countless guests over the years, many of whom returned because they had grown fond of the place, and others who came for the first time, searching for something elegant and memorable. To Tom, each meal was a chance to observe the ebb and flow of life in his restaurant, to check in with his staff, and to remind himself of why he had started this journey in the first place. The food was only part of the experience. The warmth, the hospitality, and the relationships he had built with his team were the things that truly made Jefferson stand out. As a veteran of the Marine Corps, Tom had always lived by a code. Discipline, respect, and duty had been instilled in him during his time in service, and he carried these principles into every part of his life. His approach to running Jefferson's was no different. Tom didn't believe in micromanaging. Instead, he trusted his staff, many of whom were as dedicated to the restaurant as he was. He viewed his role as more of a mentor than a boss, someone who would occasionally offer guidance or advice, but mostly worked to cultivate an atmosphere of mutual respect. His team respected him not because he commanded them with force, but because he demonstrated integrity and humility. Despite his deep connection to the restaurant and the pride he took in its success, there were still moments when Tom felt the weight of his years in the service. He was older now, his hair streaked with silver, his movements slower than they had once been. The lines on his face, etched deeply from years of hard work and sacrifice, told the story of a man who had seen much, who had lived through both triumphs and tragedies. But Tom had never been one to dwell on the past. He had learned long ago to embrace the present, to focus on the work in front of him rather than the battles of yesteryear. And in the quiet comfort of Jefferson's, he had found a sense of peace that had eluded him during his years in the military. There was something uniquely satisfying about seeing his restaurant thrive. Tom had poured his heart into the business, but unlike some owners who viewed their establishments as mere sources of profit, he saw Jefferson's as a living entity, a reflection of the relationships it fostered. The staff weren't just employees, they were a family. He had built something that transcended the confines of the business world, something that connected people on a deeply human level. The moments when a guest left the restaurant with a smile on their face, or when the team worked seamlessly to create a memorable experience, were the moments that truly fulfilled him. On any given day, Tom could be found in the restaurant's back office, reviewing inventory or discussing new menu ideas with his executive chef, or simply walking through the dining area, taking in the sounds of clinking glasses, the soft murmur of conversation, and the occasional burst of laughter. It was a soundscape he had come to cherish, a testament to the life and energy of the place he had worked so hard to build. Jefferson's was more than just a business, it was a home. And yet, despite the success of the restaurant and the sense of comfort it provided, Tom still found himself grappling with a certain restlessness. It wasn't an urgent need, but more of a quiet longing, a desire for something deeper. As much as he appreciated the routine, the daily check-ins with his staff, the regular guests who came in for a meal, there were days when he felt the weight of his own isolation. Tom had always been a solitary figure. His years in the military had taught him to rely on his own judgment, to trust his instincts, and to take pride in his ability to operate independently. But as time went on, that same independence began to feel like a burden. The quiet moments, once comforting, now felt like reminders of how much he had sacrificed to build this life, and how much of it had been done alone. Still, Tom didn't often dwell on these feelings. He was a man of action, a problem solver by nature. When something was wrong, he addressed it head-on. But the quiet ache, the sense of something missing, was always there, lurking in the background of his otherwise peaceful existence. It wasn't something he had actively sought to address. Instead, it was just a part of who he had become. A small part of him wondered whether his own desire for peace and control in his restaurant had led him to inadvertently distance himself from the people around him, from the very family he had worked so hard to create. Despite all of this, Tom had a sense of contentment in the routine of the day-to-day. His role as the owner of Jefferson's had become, in a way, his identity. It was who he was, Tom Jefferson, the Marine-turned-restaurateur. And on that particular day, as he walked into the restaurant, he was simply looking forward to continuing his usual lunch. He would sit at his usual table by the window, chat with the chefs, and let the day unfold around him. For all the unpredictability of the outside world, Jefferson's was a place of stability, a space where Tom could be himself, unhurried, unpretentious, and at ease. Little did he know, that very day, his life would be thrown into disarray, not by the chaotic rush of running a restaurant or by the demands of the industry, but by an encounter that would challenge his understanding of authority, respect, and the way he had come to view his own place in the world. Tom Jefferson had been a regular at his own restaurant for years, and though he was the owner, he often felt more like a guest than a figure of authority. His presence in Jefferson's was not one of ownership but of community, of being one with the staff and the diners who passed through the doors every day. As he walked through the elegant front doors of his restaurant on that fateful afternoon, Tom had no inkling that anything out of the ordinary would happen. It was just another typical lunch for him, another day of familiar faces, the clink of silverware, and the hum of conversation that filled the restaurant's polished dining room. The day began like any other. The hostess, Emily, was at the front desk, greeting customers with her usual warmth. The lunch crowd was light, as it often was on weekdays, but there were a few regulars in the restaurant, seated at tables along the windows, their laughter mixing with the soft jazz music playing in the background. Tom had no intention of disrupting anything. He simply wanted to check in with his chefs, see how things were going in the kitchen, and enjoy a quiet meal. His attire, as always, consisted of well-worn jeans, a faded green cap, and a t-shirt that had been through its fair share of wear and tear. His outfit was unremarkable to him. It was comfortable, familiar, and a reflection of his long-held belief that appearances were secondary to substance. After all, Tom had never been the type of person to flaunt wealth or status. His military background had taught him that who you were mattered far more than what you wore, and the success of Jefferson's had always been more about the people. The ones who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, the ones who made every meal a work of art, than the fancy details or accolades that came with it. When he arrived at the hostess stand, Emily greeted him with a slight smile, but there was something in her eyes that didn't sit right. There was a moment of hesitation, a brief flicker of uncertainty that made Tom pause. He had known Emily for over a year now, and her demeanor had always been professional, friendly, and attentive. But today, there was a palpable tension in her expression. She looked down at her clipboard, then back at him, her brows furrowed, as if she were trying to reconcile something in her mind. Tom's first instinct was to dismiss the odd feeling as nothing more than a fleeting moment. He was a regular at Jefferson's, after all. It was a part of his daily routine, and nothing ever seemed to go amiss. But when Emily's smile faltered and she cleared her throat, Tom felt a sudden, strange unease settle in the pit of his stomach. "Excuse me, sir," Emily began, her voice quieter than usual. "I'm afraid we have a dress code here. We require guests to wear formal attire for dining." She paused, her eyes briefly scanning his outfit. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Tom blinked, his mind scrambling to make sense of what she had just said. A dress code? He knew the restaurant had one, but it was always understood to be flexible, meant for guests, not for someone who owned the place. It was a code meant to ensure a certain level of formality in the establishment, but Tom had never once felt like an outsider because of his attire. His clothes, though not the picture of luxury, had always been acceptable at Jefferson's. He had worn this exact outfit hundreds of times without issue, sitting at the same corner table, conversing with the chefs, enjoying the familiar rhythm of the restaurant's daily routine. And now Emily was asking him to leave because of it? For a moment, Tom stood frozen, processing the words, struggling to understand. Excuse me?" he asked, his voice steady, though there was a quiet frustration brewing inside him. "I don't think you understand. I'm Tom Jefferson. This is my restaurant." He gestured around the dining room, as though his identity as the owner should be self-evident in the very walls that had been built under his vision. Emily's eyes widened for a split second, but her posture remained stiff. She glanced nervously toward the entrance, then back at Tom. "I'm sorry, sir, but you'll still have to follow the dress code. It's a policy we enforce with every customer, no exceptions," she said, her voice now sounding apologetic but firm, as though she were reading from a script. The lack of recognition, or perhaps the lack of acknowledgement, stung Tom more than he cared to admit. "Emily, I'm the Tom Jefferson," he said again, this time his voice more clipped, feeling the weight of the misunderstanding settle deeper into his chest. Her face remained uncertain. Emily clearly didn't know who he was, and that realization made Tom's frustration surge.
How could she not know?
Had his years of hard work, his face that had become a permanent fixture in Jefferson's over the past decade, meant so little? How could the staff, who had worked for him for years, fail to recognize him in the most basic way? Before Emily could say anything else, Daniel, the young manager of the restaurant, walked over to the front desk, sensing the tension in the air. He was new to the team, having been promoted just a few months prior. Tom didn't know him well. They hadn't yet developed a personal rapport. The manager was still in the process of finding his footing, and while Tom had always taken a hands-off approach when it came to running the business day-to-day, he noticed that Daniel seemed to be growing into his role with a quiet confidence. Daniel was smiling at first, but when he saw the scene unfolding, his smile faltered. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, looking between Emily and Tom, trying to gauge the situation. Emily quickly explained that Tom was not in compliance with the dress code, and she had asked him to leave. Tom felt the heat of the moment rising, a mix of disbelief and indignation, and he turned his gaze towards Daniel, feeling his patience slip away. "Do you mean to tell me," he began slowly, his voice tight with restrained frustration, "that I'm not allowed to eat in my own restaurant because of my clothes?" Daniel's face twisted into an uncomfortable expression, but he didn't immediately respond. Instead, he glanced at Emily and back at Tom, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. The silence that followed felt suffocating, a heavy pause that stretched on too long. Tom had never been one to make scenes, especially in public, but something about this moment felt deeply wrong to him. He could not understand how his staff, people who had worked with him for so long, people who had been trained under his guidance, could treat him, the owner, with such casual disregard. "I'm sorry, sir," Daniel said at last, his voice faltering. "I wasn't aware of the situation. Let me make sure we address this." He began to fumble for his phone, likely to call someone higher up, as if that would somehow fix the issue. But in that moment, Tom wasn't interested in waiting for higher-ups or any other procedure. The disrespect he felt was enough to make him want to walk out entirely, to remove himself from the very place he had built. "Do you even know who I am?" Tom asked, his voice carrying the weight of years spent running a business and cultivating relationships with those around him. He wasn't angry with Daniel, at least not yet, but the thought that he was being dismissed so easily, as though he were any other diner, stung. Daniel's face drained of color as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. He looked at Emily, who now appeared visibly embarrassed, as if the weight of the misunderstanding was settling on both of them. Finally, it was Antonio, a chef who had worked with Tom for years, who broke through the tension. Antonio had been in the back, preparing the lunch service, and had overheard the exchange. "Tom," Antonio called out from the kitchen doorway, his voice filled with surprise. His eyes widened in recognition. "Tom Jefferson? Is that really you?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and it was clear to everyone that Antonio had just realized the severity of the situation. The faces of both Emily and Daniel turned red with embarrassment as they finally understood who they had just dismissed. Tom stood motionless for a moment, the humiliation of the situation washing over him like a cold wave. He didn't know whether to be angry or to laugh at the absurdity of it all. The restaurant he had poured his heart into, the place that had been his pride and joy for so many years, had just turned on him in the most unexpected and demeaning way. Antonio quickly stepped forward, a sense of urgency in his voice. "My apologies, Mr. Jefferson. I didn't realize." "I'm so sorry," he said, his tone respectful and remorseful. The damage, however, had already been done. Tom nodded, though the sting of the incident still burned deep inside him. He had always believed in the power of humility and the importance of respect, but in this moment, he felt neither respected nor recognized. The moment Tom realized what had transpired in front of him, a surge of indignation swept through him, followed by a wave of disbelief. He had been turned away from his own restaurant, a place he had founded, nurtured, and loved for so many years, over something as trivial as attire. It felt as though the ground beneath him had suddenly shifted. Everything he knew about his relationship with his business, with the people he worked with, seemed to crumble in an instant. The familiarity, the comfort, the trust that had once defined his life in Jefferson's was now a distant memory, replaced by something else, something unrecognizable. He stood frozen at the entrance, the cool air from the street swirling around him as he faced his staff. Daniel, the manager, and Emily, the hostess, were now clearly embarrassed, their faces flushed with regret. Antonio, the chef, had stepped forward, trying to diffuse the tension, but Tom could see the discomfort in everyone's eyes. The silent acknowledgement that something had gone terribly wrong hung heavy in the air, thick with the weight of their shared mistake. But Tom wasn't ready to simply let it go. He couldn't. Not like this. Not after everything he had invested. Not after all the years of hard work, camaraderie, and sacrifice. He had built this place from the ground up. Jefferson's was his blood, sweat, and tears, and here he was, being treated like an outsider. The realization that his own employees had failed to recognize him for who he truly was, that they had questioned his right to be there, felt like a betrayal that went beyond a mere misunderstanding. It stung in a way he couldn't explain, and in that moment, he knew he had to make a decision. He couldn't just accept what had happened. He had to confront it, challenge it. As the uncomfortable silence stretched on, Tom took a deep breath, forcing himself to steady his mind. He had been a Marine, a man trained to navigate complex, high-pressure situations with calm precision. He could handle this, but only if he chose to act from a place of clarity rather than raw emotion. He needed to take control of this moment, to shape it in a way that could somehow restore the respect he felt he had lost, not just from the staff but from himself. "Antonio," he said quietly, his voice surprisingly even, considering the intensity of his emotions, "I need you to take over for a bit. I'm stepping out for a moment." Antonio looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes, as if unsure of what to do. He didn't want to overstep, but the respect he had for Tom was clear. It was a sentiment that had been cultivated over the years, a bond forged in the heat of the kitchen, during long shifts and countless orders that came through at a furious pace. He nodded slowly. "Of course, Mr. Jefferson. We'll take care of things here." Tom gave a single nod, then turned on his heel and walked towards the door. The sounds of the restaurant seemed to fade away as he passed through the entrance and out into the cool Chicago afternoon. For a moment, it felt as though he had stepped into a completely different world, one where he wasn't Tom Jefferson, the restaurant owner. In this world, he was just another man, an older man, walking alone down the bustling streets of a city he had lived in for years but now felt strangely alien to him. It was an unfamiliar feeling, this sense of displacement. He had always been the one who belonged, who fit in no matter where he was. But as the cold wind brushed against his face and the sound of the city's pulse filled his ears, Tom couldn't help but feel out of place, a man whose own identity had been questioned by the very people who worked for him. He hadn't expected it to hurt this much, but it did. It made him wonder whether he had been too complacent in his routine, too comfortable in his role. Was this how things had changed over time, little by little, until one day he became just another face in the crowd, easily dismissed? He walked without any particular destination, the streets around him alive with activity, but his mind was elsewhere. Tom had seen it before, the way people, both customers and staff, sometimes failed to see the person behind the facade. The owners of high-end restaurants often paraded around in suits and ties, presenting themselves as distant, untouchable figures who demanded respect simply by virtue of their appearance. Tom, however, had always prided himself on being different. He didn't need a fancy suit or polished shoes to command respect. The respect he demanded came from the work he had put in, the relationships he had built, and the example he set every day through hard work and integrity. But had that respect eroded over time? Had he let the casual nature of his approach, his decision to blend in rather than stand out, turn into a liability? As he walked, his thoughts circled back to the moment inside Jefferson's, the awkwardness, the confusion on Emily's face, the discomfort in Daniel's eyes. It was a feeling he hadn't expected, one that felt like a loss of control, a loss of connection. Tom walked for what felt like hours, though in reality, it had only been 20 minutes. His steps grew slower, and with each passing minute, the clarity he sought began to form. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It wasn't simply about a mistake made by a hostess or a manager. This was about something deeper, something that had been quietly building in the background of his life, in the routine of Jefferson's, in his relationships with the people he had trusted for so long. He had spent years building a business, but somewhere along the way, he had neglected to build something else, a deeper connection with his staff, with the people who worked for him. They respected him, sure, but did they know him? Did they truly understand who he was, not just as an employer but as a man? Perhaps, in his desire to remain grounded, to avoid the trappings of wealth or power, he had failed to communicate the significance of his role, of his presence in their lives. He had allowed himself to fade into the background, to slip quietly into the daily workings of the restaurant, but in doing so, he had blurred the line between the person he was and the person they thought he was. Suddenly, a thought occurred to him. Maybe I've been invisible. That thought stung. It made him uncomfortable, as though it were an indictment of everything he had worked for, everything he believed in. But the more he pondered it, the more it made sense. Perhaps his lack of formality, his tendency to dress casually, his preference for being one of the team rather than standing apart from them, had inadvertently created a distance between him and the people he had brought into his life. As the thoughts settled into his mind, another idea emerged. What if he had failed to lead in the way he should have? What if his attempt to be humble had come across as weakness or indecisiveness? He had always prided himself on being approachable, on being a friend to his staff, but perhaps there had been a lack of clarity in his leadership. In his desire to be liked, he had lost some of the authority that should have come with being the owner. His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Antonio. "Mr. Jefferson, I think it would be best if we talked when you get back. Please don't be upset. We all respect you. Let's fix this." Tom didn't respond immediately. He pocketed the phone and continued walking, his thoughts swirling. Antonio's message was well-intentioned, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and Tom knew that it would take more than an apology to fix what had broken inside him. There was something deeper at play here, something that couldn't be healed by a simple acknowledgement of a mistake. It was about respect, about the relationship between him and his staff, about the way they saw him, and the way he saw himself in this place he had built. Eventually, Tom found himself standing in front of a small park, the green grass in front of him swaying gently in the breeze. He sat down on a bench, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to truly reflect. He wasn't just a man trying to fix a mistake made by his employees. He was a man searching for meaning in a life that had been defined by work, but now seemed devoid of deeper connection. He had spent so many years cultivating his restaurant, but in doing so, had he neglected the most important thing of all? The people who had worked alongside him? The unfamiliar situation he had found himself in, the one that had caused him to step outside the restaurant, to confront the pain of his own invisibility, was more than just a setback. It was a revelation, a reminder that leadership wasn't just about overseeing a business or managing a team. It was about showing up, being seen, and being willing to step forward in a way that commanded not just compliance, but respect. Tom didn't immediately return to Jefferson's. After walking for hours, reflecting on everything that had transpired and the overwhelming sense of alienation that still clung to him, he decided to head back home. His apartment was quiet, too quiet, almost as if the walls themselves were echoing with the absence of the daily rhythm he was used to. It had always been a sanctuary, a small, modest space tucked away in a building not far from the restaurant. It was simple, functional, and comfortable, much like him. But that evening, it felt distant and unfamiliar, almost like a strange place he didn't recognize anymore. The quietness of the apartment mirrored the unsettled feeling he had carried with him all day. Tom sat on the couch, staring at the television without really watching it. His mind kept drifting back to the scene earlier at the restaurant, replaying it in slow motion. He could still see Emily's nervous face, Daniel's apologetic stance, and Antonio's uncomfortable attempt to reconcile the situation. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shocked look in Antonio's eyes when he finally realized who he was. That moment had lingered in Tom's mind, and he couldn't shake the image of himself standing there, looking like a stranger to his own team. He had left the restaurant in anger and frustration, but that wasn't what bothered him now. What bothered him was the creeping realization that he had distanced himself from his own business in ways he hadn't fully understood until now. He had built Jefferson's to be a place of community, a family-like atmosphere where the lines between owner and employee blurred. But in doing so, had he compromised his role as a leader? Had he become so entrenched in being one of the team that he had lost his ability to lead them effectively? As the days passed, the weight of the situation began to settle in. Tom didn't return to the restaurant right away. Instead, he chose to remain at home, giving himself the space to think. He hadn't done much thinking lately, not in the way he needed to. His daily routine had been predictable, comfortable, but also a little too automatic. He had allowed himself to coast, to trust that everything would run smoothly, relying on the strength of his staff and the system he had put in place years ago. But that trust, while never misplaced, had made him complacent. The staff had grown accustomed to his presence, yes, but maybe that's all it had been. Familiarity. The warmth of a relationship could easily fade when it wasn't nurtured. Maybe he hadn't been as involved as he should have been, not just in overseeing the operations of the restaurant, but in connecting with the people he worked with. On the third day after the incident, Tom finally decided it was time to return. But this time, he wasn't simply walking into the restaurant as the owner, expecting to be respected by default. No, he had a different purpose now, one that required him to rethink everything he had taken for granted. The old Tom, the one who believed that hard work alone would earn him respect, needed to make way for a new version of himself, a version that didn't just work in the restaurant but led with it. Walking into the restaurant that morning felt different. The usual hum of activity was still there, the clatter of plates, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables in the kitchen, the soft conversations between the servers and diners. But this time, Tom's eyes swept over the space with a different kind of awareness. He was no longer just an observer. He had to become the leader, the figure who shaped the culture of the place, not just the one who profited from it. The realization felt heavy, but it was also liberating. It wasn't just about the staff recognizing him. It was about him recognizing them as well, recognizing that leadership was a two-way street. As he stepped into the kitchen, he was greeted with quiet but warm smiles from the chefs. Antonio, who had been the first to acknowledge his mistake, was there as well, working with precision and care. The air was thick with the savory sense of the day's special, but Tom wasn't focused on the food. He was focused on the people in front of him, the ones who had become such an integral part of the restaurant's identity. They were looking at him now with a different kind of respect, not because he was the owner, but because he had made the decision to show up for them, to lead in a way that demanded more than just compliance. "Antonio," Tom began, his voice steady, but with a new sense of purpose, "I need to talk to everyone. I need to make things right." The chef, who had been peeling potatoes when Tom entered, nodded without hesitation. "Of course, Mr. Jefferson. What's on your mind?" Tom took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment, but also a quiet sense of resolve. He had been avoiding this conversation for days, but now that he was standing here, in the very heart of his restaurant, with the people who had stood by him all this time, he knew it was time to speak from the heart. "I've been thinking about the way things have been going here," Tom continued, his voice carrying in the otherwise quiet kitchen. "And I realize I've been taking a lot of things for granted. I've been here, yes, but I've also been absent in ways that I shouldn't have been. I've been treating you all like family, which is good, but I think I've forgotten what it means to truly lead you. I've been assuming that everything would just run smoothly, but I see now that leadership isn't just about being around. It's about showing up in a way that people can see, that people can rely on." The chefs stopped working for a moment, exchanging looks, some nodding slowly, others seeming to absorb the weight of Tom's words. It was clear that Tom wasn't just apologizing for what had happened a few days ago. He was apologizing for the way he had let his leadership slip into the background, for failing to be the kind of owner they needed him to be. "I've always believed that people don't work for me," he said, his voice quiet but full of conviction. "They work with me. But I think somewhere along the way I lost track of that. I wasn't here, not in the way I should have been. And it showed. I want to change that." Antonio stepped forward, his expression one of understanding. "Tom, we all know how hard you've worked for this place. We don't doubt your dedication. But you're right. We all need guidance, even if we don't always say it. Leadership isn't just about making decisions. It's about showing up, like you said. And we want to be a part of that. We're with you." Tom nodded, feeling a flicker of warmth in his chest. It was the first time in days that he felt truly connected to his team. "I'm not perfect," he added, his voice steady but vulnerable. "I've made mistakes, and I want to learn from them. But I need you all to be a part of that process. I need your feedback, your honesty. I need you to help me be the leader this restaurant deserves." The room fell silent for a moment. Then, to his surprise, Daniel, the young manager who had been the first to misinterpret the situation, spoke up. "Tom, I don't think any of us realized how much of this was on us, too. We've all been in our own little bubbles, thinking we knew what was best. but we forgot to communicate, to really check in with you. It's a two-way street." There was a murmur of agreement among the rest of the staff. For the first time in weeks, Tom felt a weight begin to lift from his shoulders. This wasn't just about the incident with Emily at the front door. This was about a fundamental shift in the way they all interacted with one another. They had all been operating in silos, not truly seeing the bigger picture, not truly connecting with each other. But now they had a chance to rebuild that trust, to reshape the way they worked together. It wasn't going to be easy, but Tom felt hopeful for the first time in a while. He turned to face the group, his tone firm but encouraging. "We've got work to do, but I believe in each and every one of you. I believe in this restaurant. And I believe we can make Jefferson's not just a place where people come to eat, but a place where they feel something. A place where they feel the care, the commitment, the love we put into everything we do. But to do that, we need to trust each other. We need to communicate. And above all, we need to respect each other, because respect is the foundation of everything." And with that, Tom felt a sense of clarity that he hadn't felt in days. This wasn't just about fixing a mistake. This was about building something stronger, something better. He wasn't just adapting to the situation. He was actively shaping it, leading it in a direction that could restore the respect and the connection he had lost. He was ready to do the work, and now, so were they. The days following Tom's decision to confront the disconnect in his restaurant were filled with a quiet but persistent undercurrent of change. There was no dramatic transformation overnight, no sweeping gestures or sudden epiphanies that fixed everything. Instead, it was a slow, often uncomfortable process of reestablishing trust, rebuilding connections, and acknowledging that the work ahead would be long, imperfect, and filled with setbacks. But it was also a process that was necessary, a necessary reckoning, not just for the staff, but for Tom himself. Tom had always been a man who believed in immediate results. The military had trained him to act decisively, to follow through with precision, to expect quick outcomes. But as he sat in his small office above the restaurant, watching the hustle and bustle of the evening rush unfold, he knew that this time would be different. This wasn't a situation that could be solved with a few hard decisions or with a show of authority. This was about the long term, about the slow, steady work of changing the very culture of Jefferson's, about regaining the respect of the staff and rekindling the sense of community that had once been at the heart of the restaurant. As he watched the chefs working in the kitchen, the servers moving in sync with one another, and the bartenders carefully crafting drinks for eager customers, Tom could sense the change was starting, but it was still fragile. The staff was more aware of him now than they had been before, aware not just of his presence, but of his willingness to be vulnerable, to admit that he needed them as much as they needed him. But that awareness was delicate, like a newly sprouted plant that needed careful tending. Tom knew that one wrong move, one misstep, could send everything back to where it had been before. The first few weeks after the meeting with his staff were marked by a subtle shift in dynamics. There was more eye contact, more acknowledgement, more open conversation. Tom found himself sitting down with different members of his team during their breaks, sometimes just talking about their day, other times discussing how they could improve the way they worked together. He started inviting feedback, something he had always been hesitant to do before. There was a quiet humility in asking his staff how things could be better, but also a recognition that their voices mattered, that their perspectives could make the restaurant stronger. But as much as things seemed to be improving, there was still a lingering tension. Tom couldn't deny that he was unsettled by the process. The changes, though positive, felt slow, almost excruciatingly so. In his earlier years, he had been accustomed to the quick satisfaction of results, whether it was securing a new business deal, winning over a loyal customer, or seeing an order fulfilled in a timely manner. But this was different. The work he had started wasn't about fixing a problem with an immediate solution. It was about rebuilding something that had slowly eroded over time, about creating a new foundation from the ground up. One of the first signs that things were changing, albeit slowly, was the way his staff began to take more initiative. Before, there had been a certain passivity in the way they operated. The servers had done their jobs, the kitchen had prepared the food, and the managers had handled the logistics. But now, there was a sense of ownership in the air. Employees started asking for more responsibility, for more chances to get involved in decision-making, and even in the creative processes that had always been Tom's domain. It was a sign that the trust he had been working to rebuild was beginning to take root. One afternoon, while Tom was walking through the kitchen, Antonio, the head chef, pulled him aside. His face was lit with a spark that hadn't been there a few weeks ago. "Tom," he said, "we've been working on a new menu for the fall. Some new specials, a bit more creative, a little bolder. I think it could really elevate the whole experience we're offering. But I wanted to check in with you first, see what you think." Tom stopped in his tracks. It wasn't that Antonio hadn't brought ideas to the table before. He had, but this time, there was something different about the way he was presenting the idea. It wasn't just a suggestion. It was an invitation for collaboration. Antonio wanted Tom's input, yes, but he also wanted to share ownership of the restaurant's direction, to create something together. It was a small thing, a subtle shift, but it meant the world to Tom. It was a sign that the power dynamics had started to rebalance themselves. The menu changes were only the beginning. As the weeks went on, Tom found himself regularly meeting with different staff members, discussing ideas they had for improving the customer experience, optimizing workflows, or even rethinking the interior decor to create a more welcoming atmosphere. It wasn't that Tom had all the answers or that he suddenly became an expert in every aspect of restaurant management. It was that he was now engaged in a constant dialogue with his staff. He was learning from them, and they were learning from him. But these conversations, these incremental improvements, were just one part of the equation. Tom knew that real change would come when the intangible elements of the restaurant began to shift, the energy, the culture, the way people interacted with one another. That kind of change wasn't something that could be planned or orchestrated. It was something that had to happen organically, through shared experiences, mutual respect, and a commitment to growth. One of the most difficult lessons for Tom to learn was the importance of patience. He had always prided himself on being able to solve problems quickly, to make decisions that led to immediate results. But this time, the solution wasn't something he could control with sheer willpower or tactical skill. The changes he was working toward were slow, incremental, and often frustratingly elusive. He had to trust that his efforts would eventually bear fruit, even if it took time. In the kitchen, he began to see the fruits of his labor. The staff worked together more seamlessly, and the energy during service was palpable. There was laughter, a sense of camaraderie, and a shared understanding that everyone was in this together. The chefs were more willing to experiment with new techniques, the servers were more attentive to the needs of their tables, and the management team was more focused on creating a cohesive and efficient operation. Tom noticed that the restaurant's overall atmosphere had changed as well. It had always been a place of quality food and great service, but now, there was an added layer of warmth and authenticity. Customers who had been coming to Jefferson's for years began to comment on the new energy they felt when they entered the restaurant. It was as though the change was not just in the physical aspects of the restaurant, but in the very air itself, a feeling that Jefferson's was no longer just a place to eat, but a place where people came because they could feel the care that went into every dish, every interaction, every moment. Yet, even with all these positive changes, Tom couldn't ignore the fact that the work wasn't done. In fact, it had only just begun. He had begun the process of transforming the restaurant, of regaining the trust of his team, but this was not a destination. It was a journey. Every day, he had to remind himself that change would take time. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and days when the old habits resurfaced. But the difference now was that Tom was prepared to face those challenges with a new perspective, one that recognized that growth and transformation weren't linear. They were messy, complicated, and full of contradictions. There were moments when the impatience crept in. A dish didn't turn out quite as expected, a miscommunication led to an unhappy customer, or a once enthusiastic staff member began to retreat back into old patterns. During those times, Tom would find himself stepping back, taking a deep breath, and reminding himself that the path to change was rarely straightforward. But he also knew that every small victory, every time a staff member took initiative, every time a customer complimented the service, every time a chef shared a new idea, was a step in the right direction. At night, as he sat at his desk in his office above the restaurant, Tom would often reflect on the progress they had made. He was no longer the man who had built Jefferson's by sheer force of will. He had become a different kind of leader, a leader who knew that to move forward, he had to create space for others to contribute, to share their ideas, and to be part of the process. And although the work was far from over, he no longer felt overwhelmed by the task ahead. Instead, he felt a quiet sense of resolve. It would take time, yes, but the time was worth it. The moment Tom had been working toward for so long had arrived. Jefferson's was busier than it had ever been. The new seasonal menu, which had been the result of a months-long collaboration between Tom, Antonio, and the rest of the kitchen staff, was finally ready to be unveiled to the public. The changes to the restaurant's interior, more intimate lighting, a softer, more welcoming decor, were now in place. And most importantly, the culture of the place had shifted. The atmosphere was buzzing with energy as the evening crowd filled the restaurant. For the first time in a long while, Tom felt a sense of satisfaction, as though the pieces he had worked so hard to put together were finally falling into place. Tonight wasn't just about a new menu or a few decorative touches. It was about Jefferson's as a whole, as a living, breathing entity, and it felt alive in a way that it hadn't in years. Tom stood by the door, watching the staff interact with customers, laughing and chatting with regulars, while newcomers marveled at the warm ambience. The servers were more confident, the chefs more engaged, and the managers, now led by Daniel, who had taken on a more active role in overseeing daily operations, were more than just facilitators of service. They were leaders in their own right, working alongside the rest of the team with a sense of pride and ownership. For Tom, this night represented more than just the culmination of months of hard work. It was a validation of the changes he had made, the trust he had worked so hard to rebuild, and the commitment he had shown to making the restaurant a place where everyone, staff and guests alike, felt valued. He had started this journey feeling disconnected from his own creation, unsure of how to lead his team without the hard edge of authority that had once defined his approach. But tonight, standing in the soft glow of the restaurant's new lighting, he knew he had come full circle. The changes, though slow, had been worth it. As the night progressed, Tom couldn't help but notice the difference in the energy of the room. It wasn't just the food, though the new dishes were met with enthusiastic praise. It wasn't just the new decor, though it certainly helped create a more inviting atmosphere. It was the people, the staff, the guests, the sense of shared ownership and community. People were no longer just doing their jobs. They were present. There was a palpable sense of camaraderie among the team, as if they were all working together to create something bigger than any one person could achieve. The laughter, the glances of mutual respect, the unspoken coordination as servers moved seamlessly from table to table, it all came together in a way that was almost magical. This wasn't the cold, transactional environment it had once been. It was a place that felt human again. And yet, despite the success of the evening, Tom couldn't shake the sense that something was still missing. The restaurant was thriving, the food was fantastic, and the staff was operating like a well-oiled machine. Customers were happy, and the reviews were beginning to pour in. But for all the progress, for all the improvements in communication and morale, Tom felt a quiet unease. It wasn't the restaurant that was bothering him, it was something deeper. Something he hadn't fully acknowledged until this very moment. The truth was, Tom had gotten what he had wanted: success. The restaurant was thriving. The team was engaged. The customers were happy. He had rebuilt the very foundation of the business. But what Tom realized that evening, as he watched his staff work together with such unity, was that this success, this outward transformation, was not enough. It was only part of the equation. The restaurant was flourishing, yes, but the internal changes he had hoped for had created something unexpected, a subtle but growing distance between himself and his original vision. He had rebuilt Jefferson's into something that worked, something that was functional, even beautiful. But in doing so, he had allowed it to become something that felt safe, predictable. He had avoided the uncomfortable confrontations, the difficult questions that often arise when you truly open yourself up to change. As he walked through the restaurant that night, smiling and greeting guests, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something important, something that had eluded him throughout this entire process. In trying so hard to make everything work, to smooth over the rough edges, he had inadvertently buried the very essence of what had made Jefferson special in the first place. The restaurant had been a reflection of him, of his own willingness to take risks, to push boundaries, to challenge the status quo.
But now, it felt safe.
And in that safety, he had lost something vital. Tom made his way into the back office, where Daniel was looking over the evening's orders. "How's it going?" Tom asked, his voice almost absent as he leaned against the doorframe. "It's going great," Daniel replied with a wide grin. "We're getting a ton of positive feedback. The new menu's a hit, and everyone's in high spirits. You can really see how much the staff's invested in this place now." Tom nodded absently, his mind still caught in the quiet storm of his own thoughts. "I know. It's amazing, isn't it?" Daniel, sensing something in Tom's tone, glanced up at him. "You don't look so convinced." "Everything's going well tonight, man. What's on your mind?" Tom hesitated. He had built this restaurant from the ground up, and he was proud of everything it had become. But for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of doubt, something he hadn't experienced in a long while. I feel like something's missing," he admitted quietly. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Missing? You're kidding, right? Look around you. We've got a full house, happy customers, an engaged team. What more do you want?" Tom shook his head slowly. "It's not about the business. It's about the heart of it. I've worked so hard to make sure everything works, but I don't know if I've made it real again. I think I've been so focused on making the restaurant perfect that I've forgotten what made it special in the first place." Daniel's expression softened. He stood up and walked over to Tom, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I get it. You've poured everything into this place. We all have. But the truth is, this place is only as special as the people who work here. And tonight, I think you can see it, we've found that again. It's not perfect, but it's something worth fighting for." Tom took a deep breath. He had always been someone who wanted to control everything, to make everything fall into place just so. But now, standing here with Daniel, he understood that perfection wasn't the goal. The goal was connection, to himself, to his team, and to the customers who came to Jefferson's looking for something more than just a meal. "I guess you're right," Tom said, a sense of relief washing over him. "I've been so focused on making things perfect that I've forgotten to feel it. I've forgotten to take risks, to push the boundaries again. I think that's what I need to do next." Daniel smiled. "Well, if you're ready to take some risks, you know I'm with you. We all are. This place isn't just yours anymore, Tom. It's ours. And we're all in this together." Tom nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in months, he felt a spark of excitement about what was to come. The restaurant was thriving, yes. But now, it was time to push it further, to rediscover the heart of what had made Jefferson such a special place in the first place. He couldn't rest on his laurels. The work was far from over. The next morning, Tom called an all-staff meeting, something he hadn't done in a while. He stood before them, his eyes scanning the room filled with eager faces, his team, his partners in this journey. "I've been thinking a lot," Tom began, his voice steady, but with a new sense of urgency. "We've come so far in such a short time. We've rebuilt this place, we've reconnected, and we've proven that we can do great things together. But I don't want us to settle. I don't want us to stop here." The room grew quiet as everyone leaned in. Tom's words carried weight, as if they knew that something big was coming. "We're going to take risks," Tom continued. "We're going to innovate. We're going to push the boundaries, not just in the kitchen, but in every part of this place. We've got the foundation now, but it's time to build on it, to take Jefferson's to the next level. And I need all of you to be part of that. No more playing it safe. It's time to make this restaurant not just a place people want to visit. It's time to make it a place they can't wait to come back to." The room erupted into applause, and Tom felt a rush of energy surge through him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had finally come home, not just to his restaurant, but to the heart of what had always driven him. The journey wasn't over. The following weeks after that defining staff meeting were a whirlwind for Tom. He had, in a sense, already completed the most challenging part of his journey. He had faced his own vulnerabilities, confronted the flaws in the restaurant's culture, and learned to work alongside his team in a way he never had before. But there was one last thing that Tom needed to do, and it wasn't something that could be accomplished through planning, hard work, or collaboration. It was about reflection. It was about looking back at the progress they had made and seeing not just how far Jeffersons had come, but how much Tom had changed himself in the process. As Tom stood in the restaurant one quiet morning, sipping a cup of coffee while the staff prepped for another busy shift, he could feel the weight of the past few months on his shoulders. The restaurant had become something entirely new. It had evolved into a place of growth, camaraderie, and creative energy. The risks that he and his team had taken had paid off, and Jefferson's was no longer just the fine dining establishment it had once been. It was a living, breathing community. The energy in the air was different now, more vibrant, more alive. And yet, despite all of this progress, Tom found himself questioning whether it was enough. Was this the end of his journey? Or was there something else left to be discovered? He had spent so long focused on fixing the external elements, the menu, the culture, the service, that he hadn't fully addressed the internal shift he had gone through. He had become a better leader, more humble, more willing to listen and collaborate, but there was still a part of him that felt like an outsider in his own restaurant. Perhaps, in all his efforts to rebuild and reinvent, he had created something that was no longer entirely his own. And while he had learned the value of trusting his team, of empowering them to take ownership of the restaurant, Tom couldn't help but wonder if he had lost a piece of himself in the process. This feeling lingered as the weeks rolled by, and it was on a quiet evening, during a rare lull between dinner rushes, that he had the conversation that would ultimately bring him the clarity he needed. It was Daniel, the manager who had become a sounding board for Tom's thoughts, who noticed the change in his demeanor. He pulled Tom aside as he was walking through the kitchen, observing the staff as they worked. "Hey, Tom," Daniel said, his voice casual, but with a hint of concern. "You've been quiet lately. Everything good?" Tom paused for a moment before answering. It had become harder for him to disguise his thoughts lately, to hide the unease that had been growing within him. He had no desire to burden his staff with his personal struggles, but the truth was, he couldn't escape the nagging sense that something wasn't quite right. "I'm not sure," he said, his tone more thoughtful than usual. "I mean, everything here is great. The restaurant's thriving, the team's stronger than ever. But I keep wondering if I've given up too much of myself in this process." Daniel frowned slightly, as if he hadn't expected that answer. "What do you mean?" "I've been so focused on changing things, on making Jefferson's better, that I've started to feel like I'm not even a part of it anymore. It's not just about the menu or the service or the culture. It's about the heart of it. I feel like maybe I've stepped back too far." Daniel let the words hang in the air for a moment, considering them. He then shrugged and smiled, his usual easygoing manner never faltering. "You've put a lot of trust in us, Tom. We've all come together to make this place what it is, and I think we've all learned from you. But maybe it's not about losing yourself in the process. Maybe it's about letting the restaurant evolve in a way that's bigger than any one person. And maybe that includes you, too." Tom nodded slowly, the weight of Daniel's words settling into his chest. "I guess that's what I'm struggling with," he said quietly. "I don't know how to stay connected to this place without losing myself in it. I've spent so many years being the one who calls the shots, the one who drives everything forward. But now, I'm not sure where I fit in anymore." Daniel placed a hand on Tom's shoulder, giving him a reassuring smile. "You fit in just fine. You don't have to be the one pulling all the strings anymore. You've built something incredible here, something that's bigger than just you. And you're still a part of it, always will be. But the next part of the journey is about letting go, about letting the restaurant become what it needs to be, and that includes trusting the people around you." Tom stood there for a moment, letting the conversation sink in. It wasn't the answer he had expected, but it was exactly what he needed to hear. For so long, he had believed that in order to maintain control, in order to lead effectively, he had to be the one making every decision. He had clung to the idea that Jefferson's was his legacy, his creation, and he was afraid that by stepping back, by trusting others, he would lose his connection to it. But in that moment, standing there in the middle of his bustling restaurant, Tom realized that his connection to Jefferson's wasn't about holding on to control. It was about the relationships he had built with the people who made the restaurant what it was. It was about the trust, the collaboration, and the shared vision. That was the heart of the place, and it was the heart of what he had created. Later that evening, after the dinner rush had settled, Tom stood by the front window, watching the last of the guests leave. The restaurant was quiet now, its usual hum of activity replaced by a peaceful stillness. He felt a deep sense of contentment, knowing that things had come full circle. The restaurant was in a better place than it had ever been, not just in terms of business, but in terms of spirit. It had found a balance between the creative vision that, too, M had always brought to it and the collective energy of his team. And while Tom knew that the work was far from over, that there would always be challenges to face, he also knew that the foundation was solid. The restaurant had evolved, and so had he. It was then that Tom realized that his return to the familiar situation, to the world of Jefferson's that he had built from the ground up, didn't mean that everything would go back to the way it had been. It wasn't about regaining control or returning to the same leadership style that had once worked for him. It was about recognizing that the restaurant had grown beyond the individual efforts of any one person, including him. It had become a reflection of the people who had invested themselves in it, a community that transcended the sum of its parts. And that was something to be proud of. As he walked through the restaurant one last time that night, making sure everything was in place for the morning, Tom took a deep breath. He felt a sense of gratitude for the journey he had undertaken, grateful for the lessons learned, the friendships forged, and the new way he understood leadership. And while he had spent so much of his life trying to perfect the restaurant, trying to control every aspect of its success, he now understood that the true measure of success wasn't about perfection at all. It was about evolution, about growth, and about embracing change. The restaurant had become a living entity in its own right, a place where people came not just for the food, but for the feeling of being part of something larger than themselves. And Tom, in his own way, had become part of that larger story. He wasn't the sole creator of Jefferson's anymore. He was a part of its ongoing narrative, just as his team was, just as every guest who walked through the door was. And in that, he found peace. The following morning, as the staff gathered for their pre-shift meeting, Tom stood at the front of the room, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He no longer felt like the weight of the world rested solely on his shoulders. Instead, he felt connected to his team, to the place, and to the journey they were all on together. And when he spoke, it was with a sense of clarity that he had never felt before. "We've come a long way," Tom began, his voice steady and sure. "And the work's never done. But I want to say something today. I want to thank each and every one of you for everything you've put into this restaurant. It's not just mine anymore, it's ours. And together, we've created something I'm proud of. Let's keep pushing, keep evolving, and keep making this place the best it can be." There was a quiet ripple of applause from the team, and Tom smiled. He didn't need to be the one pulling all the strings anymore. Jefferson's had become something more than just his vision. It was a reflection of all the people who had helped shape it. And in that, Tom had found something far more valuable than any success he could have achieved on his own. He had found a true partnership, a sense of belonging in a place that was no longer just a restaurant, but a community.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.